Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, hundreds of lives have been lost across East Africa as it's battered by torrential rain and flooding. Tanzania, Kenya and Somalia have been hit the worst. It all comes off the back of some of the worst drought the region has seen in decades. Also, the drive for more green infrastructure across Africa gets a $175 million boost at COP28 climate talks in Dubai. The African Development Bank is amongst those pledging to a fund in a push to eventually unlock billions in sustainable private investment for the continent. And Uganda's planning on cracking down on the sale of second-hand clothes shipped in from elsewhere. The government says it's a matter of pride and that the imports undermine the growth of local textile industries. But first, Tanzania is facing the aftermath of the weekend's torrential downpours. Landslides and flooding have cost over 63 lives there. The floods have exacerbated a humanitarian crisis in the region just as it emerges from the worst drought in 4 decades. In Kenya, more than 146 have been killed, whilst 490,000 displaced. Somalia has been the worst hit with more than 110 killed, but over 1 million displaced. Our regional correspondent tells us more.
This time last year, many countries in East Africa experienced a severe drought. It was the worst drought on record, and it left millions of people on the brink of starvation. But now many of these countries have gone from drought to deluge. Now, rainfall is expected at this time of the year in October and November, but this seasonal rainfall has been exacerbated this year by the El Nino weather pattern. But because the ground hasn't experienced or hasn't received water in years, it can no longer absorb the rain, which is causing dangerous flash floods across the region. Hundreds of people have been killed because of these flash floods so far in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, Somalia and Kenya, and millions of people have been displaced. The UN has described this flooding as the worst in decades. In response, African leaders are pushing for new global taxes and changes in the financial institutions to help fund solutions to climate change. Now, they're pushing for this funding at the COP28 summit, which is currently taking place in Dubai.
Olivia Bizo there for us. Now, there has been a push for international solidarity for Africa's adaptation to the fallout from global warming. All this at the COP28 climate talks in Dubai. Now, on Monday, a fund for building more green infrastructure across the continent received over $175 million in international pledges. The African Development Bank, France, Germany and Japan were amongst those who committed to boost the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. Now, it's hoping to eventually raise up to $10 billion in private sustainable capital for the continent. Our COP28 correspondent, Chloe Duma, caught up with Sanda Ojiambo, the CEO of the UN Global Compact, which is also pushing for more corporate sustainability. And she was asked why private investment is so crucial to Africa's green transition and development plans.
It really is important to also focus on the role of the private sector. I know that a lot of the COP discussions that are covered is what happens between governments, but there certainly is a very large and active private sector here. The private sector brings a lot to the table, not simply just financing. A lot of private sector are looking for investments, deep investments in climate transitions and energy transitions. They're also looking at ways in which, private sector technology can help drive forward the transitions that we need to do. Very important. I think private investment in and of its own is important. We're also leveraging private investment against public investment to provide the financing that we need collectively.
Most investors and companies today know that demonstrating some kind of social consciousness or participating in green initiatives is good for business, it's good for their image. The African private sector has made promises to help and deliver on the green agenda for the continent at Africa's last climate summit. But what do you think are the mechanisms that can guarantee that the private sector really delivers on its promises and that we avoid greenwashing?
Yeah. Greenwashing obviously is a critical issue issue in conferences such as COP. I think the first thing, in reflecting on the position of the UN, is to just make sure that any commitments to climate action, both from the private and public sector, are credible, they're verifiable, and they're accountable. At last COP, the Secretary General launched the high-level expert group on the climate action, and recommendations have been made in terms of what credible climate action looks like. Reporting, transparency is absolutely important. We, the Global Compact, was a co-founder of the Science-Based Targets Initiative that provides science and evidence-based transition pathways for public sector and private sector to make transitions. I think that's absolutely important. We can't afford to greenwash when really what is at hand is such a huge critical opportunity for the world.
And looking at the African continent, what would you say are the biggest gaps in terms of climate investment on the African continent? And how could the private sector help and fill these gaps?
Yeah, that's really important. A lot of focus has gone onto the African continent. It really does have 60% of the resources needed for climate and energy transitions. Absolutely right for that investment. I think the biggest challenge, and what we hear from African CEOs, from our Africa Business Leaders Coalition, is that first of all, they want a level playing field. You can't do business, you can't drive investment if the regulatory environment is not stable and it's not predictable. I think that is the first thing. The second piece is equitable access to finance. We know that a lot of the lending on the global stage is at rates which are far beyond affordability for African governments and for African private sectors. So really important to see how that can be made more equitable. The third, as I say, is to look at the African continent not as a victim of the climate crisis, but really as an investment destination. And a lot of African heads of state, have been calling for that. Let's invest in Africa. Let's invest actually in the developing world, because that's where we will find the most sustainable solutions for climate.
CEO of the UN Global Compact there, Sanda Ojiambo, speaking to our COP28 correspondent. Now, a Russian delegation led by the Deputy Defense Minister met with Niger's military leaders in the capital on Monday. The countries have agreed to strengthen military cooperation. Niger, along with the military regimes in Mali and Burkina Faso, are also working more closely together. Over the weekend, Niamey and Ouagadougou joined Mali in leaving the G5 anti-jihadist force. Our regional correspondent, Harold Girard, tells us more.
Niger new authorities have been distancing themselves from European government and France in particular. This time, they are taking a step back from the G5 Sahel, which was created to fight terrorism in the region, but didn't succeed to fully eradicate insecurity in most of the concerned territories. Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso recently indicated that they plan on prioritizing bilateral cooperation over affiliation with Western-backed organizations. G5 Sahel is endorsed by Western leaders and partly financed by European commissions. For the last few years, across Central Sahel, terrorist attacks had been increasing despite the G5 framework, and had continued to do so in Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso, even as the countries pursue a more independent way to fight terrorism.
Harold Girard there for us. Now, Nigerian authorities have said that several civilians were killed in an accidental army drone strike in the northwest. Although the military hasn't given an official toll for the casualties, other officials have claimed that at least 30 people were killed in the village of Tudunbiri in Kaduna State. Uganda is planning on cracking down on the sale of second-hand clothes shipped in from other countries. President Yoweri Museveni says that it's a matter of pride and that the imports undermine the growth of local textile industries. Clarice Fortuné with more.
This is Owino, Uganda's biggest market, the place to go for any trader or vendor wanting to do business. You can find everything, including second-hand clothing. Every day, hundreds of customers squeeze through the alleys looking for a bargain.
Most of them, they have a good quality. Compared to those with the new ones in the shops, then that's why we prefer to choose the variety.
But a potential government ban on the sale of used clothing threatens to sever this crucial lifeline for tens of thousands of vendors.
So if they come and ban us, number one, we are going to lose our jobs. Sustain our families is going to be very difficult. Yes.
East Africa imports about an eighth of the world's used clothing, providing jobs for some 355,000 people, harming, according to the government, the domestic textile industry.
So we have cotton. We can produce all these things that we are talking about in the second-hand market here in Uganda. And we have companies that have started producing. If you go to Mbale Industrial Park, if you go to Fine Spinners, Naitiru, and others that are coming on, can be able to replace this thing, rather these second-hand clothings, in a very pretty short time.
President Yoweri Museveni had already tried in the past to ban used clothing with the East African Community Regional Bloc support, but the alliance cracked at the prospect of losing duty-free access to US markets. In the end, Rwanda decided to go it alone. But for Uganda, the fight against second-hand clothing is back on, and the ban could potentially be implemented as early as January.
Well, that's it for Iron Africa for now. Thanks for joining us, though. Do so again if you can. Till then, take care.
The world is ever changing. The news doesn't wait.
France 24 gives a global perspective that an educated, intelligent, and active viewer is going to want to have to be able to fully understand the issues of the day.
That's why it will always be there to help make sense of world events.
J'ai l'habitude de suivre France 24 partout où je me trouve, et ce grâce à mon smartphone, parce que je ne reste pas souvent devant la télé.
Quand une information circule sur la toile, j'utilise l'application de France 24 pour vérifier l'authenticité.
For the best international coverage, 24 hours a day, no matter what, France 24 is with you everywhere, all the time.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.
The civil war in Sudan has signed the end of a short democratic interlude, and it's having dramatic consequences in the Darfur region. The Rapid Support Forces, mainly Arabs, are opposed to the regular army. They openly attack members of the Black Masalit ethnic group in a grim replay of the 2003 conflict. Are we heading towards a new 21st century genocide? Watch Reporters on France 24 and France24.com.